Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to the AuditBoard webinar, Roadmap to Confidence Process Mapping Using Flowchart. My name is Chris Brazier. I'm the head of marketing at AuditBoard. We are going to go ahead and begin here in just a moment. But the panelists and I are happy to present this webcast to all of you wherever you're joining us from. Here's our agenda today. I won't go through everything, but we're going to be discussing flowcharts and process mapping, some new terms for me. And then we're going to talk about fundamentals, process mapping with a purpose on auditors, and then answer your questions. Now I'd like to give AuditBoard's Judson Aiken just a moment to introduce AuditBoard, and then I'll introduce our speakers.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to everyone who's joining us on the call today. We're thrilled to have you taking some time out of your morning or afternoon to learn about some of the exciting things we're doing with our new partners at Lucidchart. It's also great to sponsor these types of events with our partners at Donnelly and Protiviti as well. By way of introduction, my name is Judson Aiken. I'm one of the managers of product solutions here at AuditBoard, and I'll be giving a quick overview of our company. AuditBoard is a purpose-built solution that was built from the ground up by auditors for auditors to help streamline company SOX and internal audit needs. We offer a full suite of audit management tools to help address everything from SOX compliance to operational audits, enterprise risk management, and workflows all in one integrated platform. And in terms of what sets us apart in the space, it really comes down to three key points. The first is our simple, easy-to-use, intuitive platform, which was designed by former chief audit executives and controllers to help mitigate the pain points that they were experiencing in their more manual spreadsheet-based environments. The second is our industry-leading onboarding time, which is currently averaging just about 10 business days. And finally, the last thing is our people. At AuditBoard, the majority of everyone who you'll be interacting with comes from public accounting or that Big Four background, so we'll be bringing that more consultative approach to client services more than your standard software company. These differentiators have allowed us to provide an exceptional client experience for our customers, which has in turn resulted in an over 99% retention rate. If anyone has any questions after the presentation or would like to schedule a demo, feel free to contact me at jaiken@auditboard.com, and I'd be happy to set that up. And with that, I will turn it back over to Chris so he can get the CPE event started.
Hey, thank you, Judson. I am not one of those fellow auditors, but I have family full of auditors, so I feel privileged to be here. So speaking to us today, we're going to start off and introduce our Protiviti speakers. We have Matt Lorimer and Christina Manuele from Protiviti. Matt is an associate director within Protiviti's internal audit and financial advisory practice. From our discussions earlier, Matt, we learned that you are an expert spider killer. Matt, just how tall are you?
I'm 6'9".
That is, I'm sure you were quite the basketball player, right?
Unfortunately, I wasn't blessed with excellent basketball skills, but I'm hoping that that my kids get them and they just skipped a generation.
Thank you. And we have Christina, who is a senior consultant within the same practice. Both of you are SOX experts, but I also hear that you are a coffee expert. What's your favorite drink order, Christina?
Well, there are quite a few, but right now I'm on the soy vanilla latte fix.
Okay. I also want to welcome Josh Robbins, Head of Business Development at Lucidchart, who will speak to us first. Josh, while you are not currently an auditor, you are not lost in this world, correct?
That is correct. I do have a little experience.
What background did you have before you went to grad school, or I guess MBA school?
So yeah, I did do a bachelor's and master's in accounting, and an audit internship. So I'm familiar with the space, and I can say that I now feel qualified being on this call, which is a privilege.
Yeah, funny quick story. Josh and I only met a few months ago, but I actually heard about Josh over 10 years ago. So he started a soccer company, which was once worked with Steve Nash, right, or a soccer ball company.
Yep. That is correct. That was one of the fun highlights of my career.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to you to go ahead and get started as we talk about the flowcharting fundamentals. Go ahead, Josh.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the intro. And like I said, it is a privilege to be here with these great individuals and companies on this webinar. I'm going to go through the basics and the fundamentals of flowcharting. So for those who are new to it, it'll be, like I said, this will be a nice introductory. For those who are experts, I will be touching on some tips and tricks that I think you'll be able to incorporate as well. So should be a good amount of data going through and preparing for the Protiviti section. To start off, and this is the most simple things of them all, but the first one is we want to identify the process that you want to document. And a key component of that is creating a title that is descriptive of what the process is. So keep in mind, users are going to look at this documentation and they're going to want to understand which process they are seeing. So keep that title descriptive as you think through this. The second thing you want to keep in mind is determine the boundaries. And so what we'll often do is we'll say, hey, what kicks off the process and what ends the process? And we'll create these terminators on either end. And a tip or trick that we like to employ is by highlighting the start as green and the end as red. And what that does is that helps orient the user or the reader the flow of the process. One other tip that we like to do is most of us have learned to read from top left to bottom right. And so as a rule of thumb, we try to create this flow chart going from top left to bottom right just so that users are oriented already with how they're used to reading things. The third step you want to do when doing these process maps is to brainstorm all the activities involved. Now, for some, sequence is a critical component in how they brainstorm, and for others, it might not be. So don't be tied down to sequence at this stage. If it helps, great. If not, you want to just make sure you get all the activities involved on the canvas. And at this stage, don't worry about formatting, making it really user-friendly or readable right now. You want to make sure you get all the content down at this stage in the process. You also want to decide at what level of detail you need. Oftentimes, there are sub-processes within a process. And so you want to understand how much of that is necessary for the audience of this flowchart and how much can be a sub-process that perhaps you put on a separate page. And then finally, it's important to determine, again, who's involved, what work needs to be done. I often like to just start each step with a verb, so it's easy to decipher what action is taking place there, but you don't have to do that as well. When you move on to step 4, this point you want to determine the sequence of steps if you already haven't. And so, again, this point, you reorder it, and while you're doing this, you may discover that there are additional steps that you may have missed, or there are additional sub-processes that you want to document somewhere else. So don't worry about that. It's great. This is all part of the process. Those should start coming through at this stage. And again, now is not the time you need to worry about formatting. You'll get to that at the end. The important thing is to make sure that this is well documented and it's correct. We'll go on to step 5. This point you want to map out all the key actors. And so here on this slide we have swim lanes. And those swim lanes help identify or categorize who is doing what. And I have a vertical and a horizontal swim lane. And swim lanes is one way to do it. You could do this linear as well. So don't be tied down to any one. I definitely have my preference, which is swim lanes, but you don't have to use those. And so be open in terms of how you're deciphering who's doing what. And then we'll go on to actually mapping out the flowchart symbols. This is where you start to bring in some of that formatting. This helps the users understand what type of action is happening. So we've got terminator symbols on the start and end. We have a diamond for a decision, etc. So most of these diagram tools have a library with all of these shapes in them. So it's pretty easy to just change a shape with the Lucidchart and make it work. And then the final is you want to design flowcharts as living, breathing documents. And so there's kind of six tips and tricks around that. First, you want to have one sole source of truth. Oftentimes, these can be documented in multiple systems, and you want to make sure that there is one that is declared the source of truth, and you always update that one. And when there's questions, people know to go to that source. The second is to determine the appropriate permissions for each stakeholder. So for many software, you can collaborate. Lucidchart allows you to collaborate and add multiple users in the document at the same time. But you want to make sure that for some, you give them edit access. For some, have permission to view, to comment, etc. So determine what those permissions should be, and then collaborate with them, making sure that you are involving everyone who is involved in that process to provide their input. There's a screenshot here that shows me mentioning someone where I'm asking for clarification around a certain step. And so that's a great way to either ask for approval or ask for clarification or to continue to build out a certain section. And then finally, and I'd say the most important step with designing this as a living, breathing document is to create a calendar reminder to come back and view that diagram, on an appropriate cadence. That could be monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, whatever that is. But definitely put in that reminder to come back and update that, because processes do change and businesses evolve, and so this needs to be updated. So with that, I'll turn it over to Protiviti for our first poll question.
So we're going to start with some consistent formatting and aesthetics. So Josh went over some really good basics, determining your activities, your sequence, and your key actors. But before you even start putting anything down onto your map, there's some things you need to consider. Maps are becoming more and more popular because they're easier to understand, and then instead of reading a report or a narrative, or people like to go to them because it's easier to kind of follow a process. So it's important to make sure you keep that map clear and concise and easy to follow. Again, it can go to different audiences as well, depending on what the purpose is. So you want to be able to make it so that the reader can pick it up, not know anything about the process, understand it, and know everything by the end of reading that. So one way to get this ready and clear and concise before you even put anything on your map is to establish some kind of standardized format. This is just something related to, shapes, sizing, your spacing, fonts, capitalizations, even colors. And these may seem a little bit trivial, maybe not as important as the actual documentation and process steps you're putting down, but they really do make a difference in keeping your reader on track and not distracted by, things that aren't really important. So you've got an example here on this next slide of a map that is a little bit wonky. It's still readable, yes, but you'll see that there are some boxes that are larger than others. There's not necessarily alignment. Arrows aren't really matching. There's different fonts. And again, this is readable, but depending on the type of person reading the map, I know myself, I would be a little bit distracted, and it doesn't necessarily come off as clear and concise and professional. So then you can see that same map in a different format on the next slide. And this kind of follows at least what we use as one of our consistent formatting standardized sets we put together. You'll see all the boxes are the same height. There can be different widths. You're going to have more font than in others, but it looks very clean, all the same height. Everything's in line. Spacing is pretty good. All the same font we've determined from the beginning. We're going to use this font, this size. Also notice there's a good amount of white space. So depending on the process, it may be a little bit more complex than others, but we like to try to at least have a good balance of the map with white space so that it's not overwhelming to the reader. This may mean you need to kind of spread out between a few different pages within your map, but we find that it's a lot more helpful than trying to cram everything on one page. So then in line with that, kind of coming up with that standardized format, before you start really mapping, is figuring out those symbols that you're going to be using. And as processes in both, the internal audit, SOX world, even any other world where you're mapping processes, there's more than just basic steps, more than just decisions and activities. Symbols are becoming more and more complex depending on what the process is. So it's important, again, at the beginning to set your legend with kind of giving your reader a map of what to expect and what they'll see in the map coming forward and what each symbol really means. So this should be included either we've seen at the beginning or the end of your map. We've also seen it actually throughout a map depending on how much space you have. So I'll show you some examples of those. Color coding also helps. You'll see on slide 19 an example of a legend we often use. So there's quite a few symbols on this page actually, and there's quite a few colors. One thing to note is we do use one, at least with our clients, we use one legend oftentimes for all process maps, no matter if we use all of those symbols in each map. It's helpful because, as you are drafting maps or as they change and evolve, you may end up using those symbols that you've predetermined that aren't necessarily in the map before. So just having those all in one spot, no matter what, kind of keeps everyone consistent. So when it transfers, to different editors or different people, they all know exactly what to be using. You'll notice, too, the coloring. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's quite a few colors. This helps to really differentiate things quicker within the map. One item we see, I'll keep going, is related to control types. This is something that we really need to call out because especially in the Sarbanes-Oxley and internal audit world, there's not just one type of control anymore and one type of risk. There are many different types of controls. There's a difference between automated controls, manual controls, management review controls, secondary, external audit reliance, and ones that are not relied on by external audits, even risks that are low and high. So it's really important that we can differentiate these in our maps now so that it's easier for readers to see where they need to focus if they're trying to focus on a certain type of control or risk level. So similar to those symbols you saw on that legend, I'll show you an example on this next page. So this is actually one process map that we've really used before. It's from a client we've obviously scrubbed, but you can see just how many different types of controls are actually in one process, even on one page. So you'll see we've got an upside-down green triangle, which goes with our manual controls, and then we've got our blue squares, which are automated controls. So you can kind of see those three gathered there. You can, just by looking at this, you can see, okay, there's a lot of system interaction here and system controls going on right there. We've also got a management review control in orange there. So that may help to focus, okay, if we're looking at this process, we need to make sure we get the review procedures down for that control. I'll keep going through. This is one big process map, just 3 pages, but you'll see just through those pages how many different controls there are. So going back and forth, there's management review, manual, automated. You'll also notice that there's red and yellow triangles. These are related to risks associated with the controls we have on there. So again, you can differentiate types of risks. There's not just an overall risk base anymore. A lot of times there's low risk, high risk, medium risk. So again, by calling those out with colors, you should really be able to determine on the map where they're at and easily identify maybe what has a higher risk area versus a lower risk area. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit more about fundamentals of formatting.
Yeah, Chris, did you have something you wanted to add in before we continued on?
Yeah, we had a great question from an audience member here. Regarding the color controls, how does a user know what action the controls are linked to? Should the color control be input in the box?
Okay, so I'll go back to one of those examples so we can see. So if you'll notice, for example, on this page, you've got these blue squares that are the automated controls.
We're not there yet.
And they are right above the steps that you've kind of written. So usually what we've done is in those steps, those white boxes, that's where we'll kind of put the steps. Those aren't necessarily the risk or the control descriptions yet, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. We've got kind of a way to address that if you want to actually know what the control wording is. But for now, it's just we have the control number written right underneath whatever symbol it is, and then make sure we color in those symbols right above where the actions are. So we're not actually coloring the action boxes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think something, to add on there, Chris, going back to Christina's earlier discussion about the standardized formatting, I myself have not seen that kind of a methodology in terms of coloring those action boxes, but that's certainly a way to help to declutter a page potentially. If that was an approach that someone wanted to take, right, you can definitely, kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone by having a green box as opposed to an action box with a control on top of it or near it. So, that, again, plays into that standardized formatting, and it is definitely something that can be considered. There's really no right answer. As we talk through a lot of these concepts today, some of them will build on each other. You may make a decision to go with one versus the other, use all of them. So, whatever kind of works for you and your team. There are definitely standardized action boxes. We're not necessarily covering those today. Decision points, manual processes, systems, things like that. The control symbols, the triangles, the squares, and those colors are not necessarily standardized, but we've kind of standardized them, at least here in our office. But we notice that some of our clients will do things totally different than others too. So hopefully that helps to answer that question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we'll just get back into the content here, and did see that kind of a low turnout on that survey in terms of users of Lucidchart. So I know probably a lot of people anxious to kind of hear a little bit more about Lucidchart, and I think we had a couple questions around that as well. So I know Josh will probably get to talk through that a little bit later as well. So going back to the swim lane or linear flowchart discussion that Josh mentioned earlier, right? We talked about the key players and, those key players, who they are, what departments they're in, things like that, and how we showcase those key players is going to have an effect on how your process map looks. You've got to really decide, even before you start to document that process map, what format you're going to use. Again, whether it's a swim lane or a linear flow chart, just because of the way that you're arranging the shapes on that template, the flow, right, and how the different actions are shown. So you not to say that you can't change your mind or flip-flop between them, but you've got to make that decision earlier on. And so, in order to do that, you've got to understand the pros and the cons of the two of them. So I'll kind of flip back and forth here on the current slide, which shows a swim lane. You can see that there's quite a few processes that are actually taking place simultaneously. They're performed by different departments, different people within those departments, and on the linear chart, depending on what the process is and how many of those simultaneous steps are going on, it can be harder to tell, at least at first glance, who is doing each of those steps, what kind of time difference might occur between them, and some of those dependencies. So again, there's definitely advantages and disadvantages. We've condensed this process map, sort of on purpose, but when you've got multiple departments involved and you've got a longer, more complicated process with a lot of back and forths, right? Matt sends file to Christina, Christina sends to Chris, checks in with Josh, so on and so forth. That swim lane can take up a lot more space. And so, that's definitely something to consider. But there's also a lot of other pros and advantages to the swim lanes. It helps to show that division of labor. The different departments or users can focus in on their specific area, and it can help to call out redundancies and inefficiencies as well. And then last but not least, I apologize, I meant to go back. The linear maps are generally can be a little easier to document. They're smaller and they can, again, be easier to follow because you're more or less going in a straight line or from up to down. So next, we'll talk about high-level summaries. I'm sure that most of us on the call here today have worked with long and complex process maps, and I'm sure a lot of us have had to document as well those long and complex processes. We're not all lucky enough to get those one-page or two-page process maps. If they were that simple and that easy, we probably wouldn't need a process map to document them, right? So, giving a high-level summary map, can help, all readers to understand those complex maps. And it's also really helpful for executives or other members of the team that may have some oversight of the process as well, because you can get lost pretty easily by the time you get to page 10, page 15, 20, and I don't even want to shudder to think of a process map that might be longer than that, but I know they exist because I've worked on some of them myself. So the purpose of that high-level map is to help the reader to dive into a specific area of that process where they're concerned, whether that's where they are involved, maybe that's where more risk exists, or again, if you just wanted to also boil that complex process down to just a few boxes, we can easily get lost in the minutia of each step and forget how those sub-processes tie together. So On the next couple slides here, we'll show a really quick example. A revenue and accounts receivable map here. Again, this is a real life example, but it's been generalized, obviously. So you see here on this slide, process looks pretty simple, right? We've got a contract, there's a credit process, cash application, and so on and so forth. But really that high-level map, it narrows us in on the specific pages for each of those sub-processes and helps us to understand that general flow and how those steps are connected. But it really doesn't do as much justice to all of the individual processes that exist within. So you can see on this slide, contract creation is not as simple as it may have appeared initially, which is fine. We've got to definitely demonstrate all of the intricacies of that process. But again, that's that first major sub-process, and that ties into the contract activation process, which again comes next. So having those high-level summaries is really a big help to tie those together. I'll pass it back to Christina.
All right. So based on those answers, clearly there are a bunch of different purposes for process mapping. Again, SOX and internal audit seem to take the cakes, but we're going to talk about now more than just the fundamentals of process mapping, and now talk into how you can tailor your maps for these uses. So one item is related to what we like to call one-stop shop. So as many of you know that are in the SOX or internal audit functions, there are a lot of different source documents we use when creating a process map. We've got risk and control matrices, which list out those risks and control descriptions. We've got process narratives. We've got reports, IT documentation, policies and procedures. And so we're using all of these to then create our process maps. And so in recent times, we've seen our clients actually request that we marry up our process maps with these other documents so that it's less flipping back and forth between, all right, here's the control matrix, the flow chart. It's got this control number written on it. Let's now reference the RCM to see what that control is. So we like to do this in what we call the one-stop shop method. So we like to include all of this information in our maps in a one-stop shop format so that you can flip between pages in your map instead of pages in different documents with your map. So this can include process owners, in-scope applications, obviously your risk and controls, third-party service providers, pretty much anything that you want to put in this map, you can. So I'll give you an example coming up. So this is just a regular map. We've seen this before in this presentation so far. So it's got the steps and it's got those risks and controls, but it's just got, again, those risks and control numbers right under those symbols, and they're right next to, where they should be occurring in the process. But what if we want to know more? We want to know what's the actual description of that control and that risk, and also who is performing that. It looks like, in one of these boxes it says the VP of FP&A performs one of these controls. Who is that? What are they doing? What's their background? And what systems are they using? So to do that, we've added in our one-stop shop a couple almost summary slides at the end, or pages at the end of our map. So we'll jump to one of those examples. This one, again, our example is the revenue recognition process, but this happens at the end of our map. It includes, the process scope, maybe, a little bit of, again, a high-level summary of what was going on in that process. The process owners, so it's got those titles and actually the names in case, you need to point to a control, see who does it, and then be able to, reach out to that contact. We've got the systems, critical spreadsheets, just kind of any information that you would want that would come from an RCM or, policies and procedures or a narrative, kind of put here. In terms of risk and controls, as those can be a little bit longer, we usually end those on their own sheet at the end of the map. This one you can see has got the risks and the controls laid out it's got their names and their numbers, and their descriptions listed. Obviously, this is a little bit, smaller than we've seen in a lot of other maps. There's more than just, 3 or 4 controls or 3 or 4 risks involved. So this may grow to a couple pages, or you may realize that this one-stop shop method, if you've got too many controls or too many risks, just isn't going to work if it's too large. But otherwise, we have found that a lot of even external auditors or reviewers or, process owners really appreciate this because, you're going from, you start with that high-level summary that Matt discussed. I want to focus in on this area. Okay. You go to that page, you see a couple controls. you see related to a specific process owner, you want to go see who that is and see what the control is, and you can just jump to the back of the map and see those. Next piece, which was actually kind of noted in one of those questions, was related to information provided by the entity. So this is also known as electronic audit evidence, if you don't call it IPE, internally prepared evidence, completeness and accuracy validation. So there's a ton of names for it, but it's basically, this information that the entity provides that we are trying to validate if it's complete and accurate, that they're using it in their controls. So in recent years, this has become a very hot topic, especially in the SOX and internal audit world. So of course, we've got to address it and make sure we've got it called out in our maps and in all of our process documentation so that we can make sure to do the due diligence around that IPE that we need to do. So with IPE, this is similar. We address it similar to the other items that we've got. So we add a new symbol for it. We make sure we call it out in our maps. And we've even got symbols for both the IPE and the IT systems or applications they're coming from. And it can be reports, queries, spreadsheets, any different items. So I'll go ahead and give you an example on this next slide of a process flow in which there's quite a bit of IPE actually. It looks like you'll see the document kind of symbol showing reports or queries or even Excel spreadsheets that we would see as IPE. We've also got a symbol that's the green rectangle, which we add in to show which application or which system that IPE may be coming from. So it's again just really helpful to be able to go to a page in the map, see what IPE is involved. Normally, this map was made to just focus on the IPE portion, but you may have controls on this page, right? So if you see a control symbol next to an IPE symbol, there you go. You're going to know you need to focus on that for your control and make sure you get all the support you need. In addition, this kind of piggybacks as well onto the one-stop shop. This is another item you can include in one of those summary pages at the back. So again, you've got the process scope, process owners, and then you can add in that IPE or EAC that you call it, and include, the report names, Excel spreadsheet names, the systems that they're coming from. Even if you wanted to, you could include who is providing those, who's generating those, the frequency that they're generated. So again, this is just kind of another highlight of that one-stop shop and how anything that becomes popular, hot topics in our industry can be added to this if need be, just so that everybody's got visibility to it. So that is the last piece of that. So again, now I'll pass it over to Matt. Oh, he wants to go back one.
Yeah, just wanted to kind of add on, to something that kind of building on earlier concepts. So we talked about, when we talked about the aesthetics of the map and making sure to leave some white space. Some of you are probably looking at this map and saying, well, if there's this much IPE, there's probably a lot of controls that exist within that map. And so again, as Christina mentioned, the purpose of this map is not to show the 15 controls that may hover around these IPE reports, but it does go to show that if you cram everything onto one page, which I think sometimes we have a tendency to do, to take up one page rather than 3 or 4, it can get to be a lot to take in. So, there likely would be a few different controls that would be on this page, and if there were, it again would be a lot to absorb. So this is a map that, in that case may make more sense to be on 2 or 3 pages to not overwhelm the reader. Again, wanted to make sure we pointed out that there likely are some significant controls around these IPE reports and things, but again, the purpose here was to focus on just that one concept. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about more of an internal audit focused process map. We've talked a little bit about SOX, and a lot of the concepts overlap certainly, but when we talk about an internal audit map, generally the formatting is going to look pretty similar, but we'll oftentimes introduce at least 1 or 2 new shapes or symbols. Again, going back to that legend we talked about, something you would integrate there. And those symbols are going to be for documenting control gaps or process improvement opportunities. In some of our clients, we use the different phrase between a control gap and a process improvement opportunity to indicate the severity. So you may use the same shape for both types of items. You may not even differentiate between the two of them, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. So an internal audit, right, is an assessment as of a point in time. And because of that, we might identify those gaps or those opportunities, and we want to showcase them in that map, with the hopes that in the future those items would be remediated, removed from the map, and then you'll probably start to see some more triangles or other shapes indicating those controls that we recommended. So the thought here, is to showcase those improvement opportunities, those gaps. You see on the current slide, that blue hexagon, right, is that first control gap. We have a risk there that hasn't been mitigated or hasn't been appropriately mitigated. It could be either or. And on the next slide, again, there's a different gap that exists there. The maps, generally would be linked and tied together to your RCM and subsequently to your audit report as well. So you can see here that risk 2, which relates to telecom usage, right, has a gap that hadn't been mitigated, and risk 3, which relates to expenses, also had a gap. And so the map and the RCM, they tie out to each other. Again, those control gaps would result in recommendations and newly implemented controls after that report has been issued and you've had a chance to make those changes. So definitely something that you can utilize in your process maps, and even if you hand those maps over, it can kind of be something for that process owner to show, hey, we've made some improvements in the process. We did have a question that came through about placement of these items. So just to read that question, how would the reader know which risk control falls where in the process if it's not attached directly to that process box? See, there's a couple different schools of thought. I'll go back one slide. You can generally either source that risk where the risk occurs, or you can source those shapes where the control occurs. Generally, we would settle on where that risk occurs, and really it's just a matter of kind of performing that assessment to determine where it best lies. A lot of times you might end up showcasing a risk and a control in multiple places because it can happen in a lot of different places. But it sometimes is a matter of personal preference as well. Going back to the standardized documentation format we talked about earlier, you got to sometimes just have to get that team on the same page. If you end up with a risk or a control that's sort of pervasive throughout that map, you may even end up with a section of your page that's maybe labeled, right, pervasive, or kind of hovers above that page at the top, or so on and so forth. So, a couple different options there.
I also wanted to jump in real quick and note that legend on that page. We discussed before that it could be before or after, at the beginning or the end of your process map. But you can also, if you have space and would like to include it, you can include it on that map. So that's just kind of a little example on the way there.
All right. So next up, we'll talk about some operational processes that have started to make their way into process maps or flowcharts. We've started to see a lot of requests from our external audit colleagues and a lot of our process owners as well at our clients, where they want to include some process steps that are related to a process in question, but they're not specifically financially relevant for SOX or internal audit, or they may be applicable or relevant, but they just don't have any controls on them. I think a lot of times you've probably heard a phrase of, well, if there isn't any risk or control there, then why have we documented it? And that was kind of an old rule that I had heard, and it's not necessarily gone out the window, but it's less in play today. Again, there's a lot more instances now where you've got that full start to finish picture of the process, and so that's where these operational processes can come in. It's a great method to document that step-by-step process with all of the decisions, the tie-ins to related systems, checklist steps, things like that. So on this example here, you can see, and again, I know it's probably a little hard to read, but that gray box with that red text is a link back to a checklist that the user is supposed to be completing as they work through this process. And so this intentionally, there are no controls or risks on this page, and that's not by omission. That's an accurate representation of this process. So, you might say, well, this isn't necessarily pertinent for that part of the map, but again, showcasing that the middle step of that holistic process, or it could be the beginning or the end, because that's all relevant and good information for the reader to understand. And just as kind of an aside, this is an ASC 606 revenue recognition checklist. I'm sure a lot of us are going to be spending some time with these this year with that requirement coming into play as of December 15th. So if you haven't seen one of these before, you might see it a little bit later in the year.
One other thing to note, too, is with labeling these steps, earlier I know a lot of people use this for SOX and internal audit, but there was still a good chunk of you that use these just for, policies and procedures and manuals. So this is a good way to kind of differentiate, all right, this is step one in the process, step two, or, call out different areas or different maybe people responsible in the process in a different way instead of just, using it for SOX and internal audit. So it can carry across different purposes as well.
Okay. And last concept we wanted to kind of retouch on, right? Josh mentioned the living, breathing document a little earlier, and some of the ways that Lucidchart helps to do that. I think we've all had times in the past, I can remember one, just a few days ago, where we've had a change that came up and it needed to be integrated into our process map, and you can't remember whether you made that change or someone else was supposed to make the change and you want to validate that they did it correctly. So whether that's a new system, a job title change, right? If a senior accountant gets promoted to an accounting manager, or we upgrade from, SAP version 3 to version 4, whatever that case may be, integrating those items, integrating a method to track those items into your process map can help, expedite some of the efficiency of that. So keeping a log of major revisions to the process map, who last made those revisions, integrating approval of that documentation into the map as well, or the document can be a big help. So we've kind of showed a couple of really quick examples here on the screen. Again, you can see that a high-level summary of document history, the document sign-off there, as well as the location of that file name. So this is a really easy way to track some of those items, and it ties into Josh's tip on that annual update, right? So having that calendar reminder, you go in, you make your updates, and then you track on the file itself that you've done those updates for fiscal year 18 or for the Q2 evaluation, so on and so forth. So with that, I'll pass it back to Chris.
Thank you, Matt. We have a few questions that came up during the presentation about Lucidchart and some of the differences. So Josh, I want to turn some time over to you really quick, talk about it, and maybe some of the major differences between Lucidchart and other platforms.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Chris. So it looks like the majority are using Visio, which is a great tool, very powerful. And with Lucidchart, we've got a couple, I would say probably three major differences between Visio and Lucidchart. The first is we are cloud-based, and that allows us to do several different things, one of which would be having integrations. And so I think that's actually a big differentiator, especially with AuditBoard, where we have an integration with AuditBoard. So you could design and build all of your process maps and flowcharts in Lucidchart, and those will actually display right within AuditBoard. And if you were to go back and make any changes to that document in Lucidchart, those will then display within AuditBoard. So there's no copying and pasting. There's no shifting around things. It literally will live within AuditBoard as well. That's one big reason. And we have integrations with other systems such as Microsoft Office 365, Google Docs, etc. So you could place these diagrams in a whole host of systems you already use so that the users don't have to go back and forth between systems. The second thing that I think makes us different from Visio is just we overall are a little bit more of a user-friendly solution. So Visio is extremely powerful. I think some can become daunted a little bit just thinking about how, hey, I'm not a power user or whatever that may be. Lucid's pretty simple in terms of just drag and drop, connect box, reformat things quite easy. And so we pride ourselves in really analyzing how the users are using the product and making it more and more simple, yet still maintaining all that power that Visio brings. And the last one I would say is, again, because LucidChart is a cloud-based product, we have all this collaboration. There's real-time collaboration. So I can be in the same document as Chris and Matt and Christina. We can all be in the same document at the same time, updating it. And so you can build things quicker. You can build things more comprehensive. And again, you can edit permissions. So some may be view, some may be edit. But you can all be in there, updating at the same time, similar to like a Google Doc if you've been in there. And that helps, again, be more collaborative, but be quicker and more efficient with how you're building this as well. One key component of that is we have a revision history. So it actually logs and tracks every single change made to every doc since its creation and by whom. And so you have that always there. You can always go back and revert to previous states at any given point. And then as a side note, you can import Visio documents into LucidChart. And then, so no work needs to be redone if you already have Visio documents. And again, you can export those back to Visio if you prefer that. And then you can also export that to a PDF, print, do a whole host of things, including sharing a view-only link to others. So there's lots of ways to share the work that you've done, but a PDF would be one of those. And again, if you prefer to get back into Visio or you have other users who want to use Visio, you can bring that in, edit it, and push it back to Visio and collaborate with the rest of your team in that way as well.
Hey, thank you, Josh. And kind of speaking to the AuditBoard integration with LucidChart as well, AuditBoard, we were formerly known as SOX Hub. We've traditionally had most of our experience in the SOX compliance realm, and as we offer other operational audits or other compliance programs, there's more and more use cases for using LucidChart within the AuditBoard platform. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I see a few questions here. I don't know if there's any that we want to handle. We're able to handle the next 2 minutes as a team.
I think the one thing I'd say, Chris, is that for those who, I think there's some questions around how the integration works, and for those I think who are interested, either reach out to myself or Chris. We'll put that contact information up, and we can actually show you how it works. That way it's easier for you to grasp exactly how that integration works and how it would improve your workflows.
Yeah, those attending and those that are registered will be eligible to receive a 1-year free license to LucidChart, as Josh and I have spoken about. For details on that, we'll include it in our email to everyone on Friday with the slides and the recording. But if your company does not have already an enterprise agreement with LucidChart, we can set you up with a free account to try it out, for your team to check it out, and for you to import your files and start integrating them into the AuditBoard platform. I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Matt and Christina, Protiviti, for your help and for your expertise in flowcharting, and Josh also from LucidChart. If you have any questions, please contact us, any of us here. Thank you, everyone. Remember to go ahead and answer the webcast survey at the end to be eligible to receive that CPE credit.